Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. And what a moment to be talking about infrastructure, because today's story is one of those slow burn developments that suddenly just exploded into undeniable significance.
That's exactly right, and I want to set the stage for listeners who might not have been following this closely, because what we're talking about today is genuinely one of the most consequential behind-the-scenes stories in all of AI right now.
We're talking about MCP, the Model Context Protocol, which quietly crossed 97 million installs on March 25th of this year. And that number isn't just impressive, it's historic by any measure of AI infrastructure adoption.
Let's start from the beginning for folks who haven't heard this term before. Because MCP is one of those technical standards that sounds dry on the surface, but absolutely changes everything about how AI agents actually function in the real world.
The simplest way I can explain it is this. Before MCP existed, if you wanted your AI agent to connect to, say, your company's Postgres database, your Slack workspace, and your GitHub repository, you had to build 3 completely separate custom integrations from scratch.
And not just once, you had to build those integrations separately for every single AI provider you wanted to use. So if you were using Claude and GPT and Gemini, you were potentially maintaining 9 different integration codebases just to connect 3 tools.
That's the nightmare scenario that MCP was designed to eliminate entirely. And it does so with an elegant client-server architecture where the AI agent is the client and the MCP server is what exposes the tools, data, and capabilities.
So the analogy I keep hearing is that MCP is basically the USB standard for AI tools. You build the integration once as an MCP server, and then literally every MCP-compatible agent can use it without any additional work.
And what's remarkable is how quickly that analogy became reality, because by mid-March 2026, every single major AI provider had shipped MCP-compatible tooling as a default feature. OpenAI, Google DeepMind, Microsoft, Meta, Cohere, Mistral, all of them.
That level of cross-industry adoption in a matter of months is essentially unheard of for infrastructure standards. And the comparison to Kubernetes is really telling here, because Kubernetes took nearly 4 years to reach a comparable level of enterprise deployment density.
MCP did it in roughly 6 months from when it started gaining serious traction, and the 97 million figure actually represents SDK downloads across Python and TypeScript. So it reflects actual developer adoption rather than passive interest.
Now, part of the story here is that Anthropic made a really smart strategic decision back in December 2025 when they donated MCP to the Agentic AI Foundation, which is a new directed fund under the Linux Foundation umbrella.
That was a pivotal moment because it transformed MCP from being Anthropic's protocol into a genuinely neutral open standard. And the co-founders of that foundation include Anthropic, Block, and OpenAI, 3 organizations that are fierce competitors in the model space.
When Anthropic and OpenAI are co-founding something together, you know the industry has reached a moment of consensus that's extremely rare. And it sent a very clear signal to the enterprise market that this is the infrastructure to build on.
The Platinum membership list also reads like a who's who of enterprise cloud infrastructure. AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Cloudflare, and Bloomberg all signed on. And that participation basically guaranteed that MCP would be available natively across every major deployment environment.
And speaking of enterprise, this is where the real-world impact stories start to get genuinely jaw-dropping. Because Block, which is Jack Dorsey's company behind Square and Cash App, actually eliminated 340 custom API connectors by standardizing on MCP.
Think about what that number means operationally. 340 separate integration code bases that had to be maintained, tested, updated every time an upstream API changed, and secured against vulnerabilities. All of that complexity was just eliminated by adopting a single standard.
Apollo, the go-to-market platform, reported cutting their integration maintenance overhead by 60%. And these aren't small marginal wins. That's freeing up entire engineering teams to build actual product features instead of just keeping the plumbing running.
There's also a really interesting data point on the AI quality side, not just the efficiency side, which is that Claude's tool use error rates dropped 40% in March 2020. And a significant portion of that improvement is attributed directly to MCP's standardized communication layer.
That makes intuitive sense when you think about it, because before MCP, agents were essentially improvising their way through heterogeneous API interfaces with inconsistent schemas and error handling. And standardization removes an entire category of failure modes.
The ecosystem numbers are also remarkable at this point. There are somewhere between 5,800 and 10,000 active public MCP servers covering essentially every category of enterprise tool: databases, cloud providers, CRM systems, developer platforms, analytics, communication tools, the works.
So the picture that emerges is that by Q1 2026, you had Fortune 500 companies moving their agentic AI programs from pilot projects to full production deployment, and MCP was the infrastructure layer that made that transition safe and scalable enough to actually do.
What I find particularly fascinating from a power dynamics perspective is that MCP fundamentally reshapes who controls the integration layer in enterprise AI, because previously that was a source of enormous platform vendor lock-in.
Walk me through that, because I think this is an underappreciated dimension of what's actually happening here. What changes about the leverage dynamics when MCP becomes universal?
Before MCP, if you were, say, Salesforce or ServiceNow, and you wanted your enterprise customers' AI agents to work with your platform, you were in the driver's seat because you controlled the custom API integration. You set the terms, and switching away was extremely painful.
And now that shifts because any enterprise can build or use an MCP server for any tool. And if one AI agent provider treats them poorly, they can switch to a different agent without rebuilding a single integration. The tools just follow.
Exactly right, and the analysis I've seen identifies clear winners and losers from this shift. Infrastructure companies shipping MCP servers, like Datadog, Snowflake, MongoDB, are in a stronger position because their tools become universally accessible.
Whereas the losers are the integration platform as a service companies that charge significant fees to maintain those custom connectors, because now their core value proposition, "I'll connect your tools for you," is being commoditized right out from under them.
There's a parallel here to what happened when TCP Pulse IP standardized internet communication. Because before that, you had proprietary networking stacks and vendor lock-in all over the place. And standardization created an enormous wave of new application development.
That's a bold comparison, but I think it holds up when you look at the trajectory, because Gartner is now predicting that 40% of enterprise applications will include task-specific AI agents by the end of 2026. A figure that would have seemed fantastical just 2 years ago.
And that prediction assumes MCP-style standardization continues to hold. Because without a universal integration layer, the complexity of deploying agentic AI at enterprise scale would have remained a serious bottleneck for years.
Let me push back on the optimistic framing slightly, because there are real questions about what happens when a critical piece of infrastructure that started as one company's internal project becomes the foundation that everyone depends on.
That's a legitimate concern, and it's precisely why the Linux Foundation donation was strategically important. Anthropic essentially preempted those concerns by giving up unilateral control before MCP reached the scale where that control would have been genuinely dangerous.
Though critics would note that Anthropic, Block, and OpenAI as co-founders still represent a fairly narrow slice of the industry, and there are questions about whether smaller AI companies and open source projects have meaningful governance voice.
True, and the foundation structure is something that bears watching as it matures. But compared to the alternative of a proprietary protocol controlled entirely by one company, having a Linux Foundation governance model is a meaningful improvement, even if it's imperfect.
What's the technical roadmap looking like from here? Because 97 million installs is the current state. But what's actually coming that would take MCP from its current capabilities to something even more transformative?
The most anticipated developments are streaming and real-time data support, which is expected in Q3 2026. And that matters because right now MCP operates primarily on request-response patterns. You ask for something, you get something back.
And streaming would allow MCP servers to push real-time updates to agents continuously, which opens up a completely different category of use cases like live market data feeds, continuous monitoring, and event-driven AI workflows that react as things happen.
The other big one is multi-agent coordination primitives, which is the infrastructure for making multiple AI agents work together through MCP rather than just a single agent talking to multiple tools. That's genuinely the next frontier for enterprise agentic AI.
So you could have, say, a research agent and a synthesis agent and an action agent, all communicating through standardized MCP channels, each with access to different tool sets, and they're essentially forming an AI workforce rather than just a single AI assistant.
And critically, because MCP is an open standard at that point, you could mix agents from different providers. A Claude agent coordinating with a GPT agent through the same protocol layer, which would have been almost unimaginable to actually deploy even 18 months ago.
There's also the question of security and verification. Because right now, the ecosystem has grown so fast that there are genuine questions about the security posture of all these MCP servers that developers are building and deploying.
That's the honest concern that practitioners raise consistently. The ease of creating an MCP server is also the ease of creating a malicious MCP server. And there's active work on formally verified server implementations and security certification frameworks to address that.
The broader significance of this milestone to me is what it says about how AI infrastructure actually evolves. Because there was a real moment in late 2024 where the industry could have fragmented into 5 or 6 competing proprietary agent protocols.
And the fact that it didn't is partly due to technical merit. MCP is genuinely well designed. And partly due to Anthropic making the politically sophisticated decision to open source it and invite competitors in rather than trying to win through exclusivity.
Which is a fascinating strategic bet that has clearly paid off. Because MCP's ubiquity now means Claude agents work everywhere by default, which is a massive distribution advantage, even though Anthropic technically gave up ownership of the protocol.
It's the classic open source platform play, Red Hat with Linux, Elastic with Elasticsearch, where you create the standard, give it away, and then build value on top of the ecosystem you just created rather than trying to charge for the standard itself.
And for developers and enterprises listening to this, the practical implication is pretty clear. If you're building AI agents or integrating AI capabilities into your products in 2026, MCP is not a consideration. It's the baseline assumption.
The question worth asking isn't whether to use MCP anymore. That decision has been made by the industry collectively. The question is how sophisticated your MCP server architecture will be and how quickly you can take advantage of the multi-agent coordination capabilities when they arrive.
As we wrap up, I'd love to hear your perspective on what you're watching most closely as this story continues to unfold over the remainder of 2026 and into next year.
I'm watching the governance evolution of the Agentic AI Foundation most closely because the Linux Foundation model works when it truly reflects broad community input. And with something this consequential to enterprise AI infrastructure, getting governance right matters enormously for the long term.
That's a really important dimension that I think gets lost in the excitement about the adoption numbers, because the numbers are impressive, but sustainable infrastructure requires sustainable governance. They go together.
Exactly, and I'd also watch for the first major security incident involving an MCP server. Because how the community responds to that will tell us a lot about the maturity of the ecosystem and whether the verification frameworks being built actually hold up under pressure.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.